In our chapters thus far, we have found a universe of unimaginable scale with no foreseeable ends at either extent of our perceptual reach. Equally with an unfathomable age, again recognised as having no foreseeable ends. We have thrown around the concept of infinity and tried to visualise what it might mean for us, set as we are, within our own finite perspective. The hope so far is just that we might have begun to stir the pot of intrigue. But ongoing, it's hoped that this intrigue will build towards an unyielding zeal for the questions that hide behind answers, building a skeptic's instinct for questioning the presupposed, so that when faced with dog-eared riddles like, "Why are we here?" we will know to firstly clarify the seemingly obvious, i.e., what is meant by why, we, and here. Within the preceding chapters, we temporarily exchanged our why for how, and spent some time discussing the here. So let's shift our focus once again and try to understand the selves that shape the collective we. Who or what is the perspective holder we are trying to identify? And where does it fit into our picture of reality? If we return to our first assumptions, we each believe that we are alive. Alive within a physical body that gives rise to consciousness and thus a sense of self. But which came first? The body or the life? We may have actually heard questions of this nature before. Which came first? The egg, as one declares so confidently. Obviously it's the egg. I mean, dinosaurs came from eggs, didn't they? Next question. And of course, if we are to contain our thinking strictly to the words offered within the posit, then such confidence is hard to deny. Eggs came before chickens, just as life presumes a body. But maybe such an arrogant dismissal is a little unfair, since at the heart of this ancient philosophical inquiry lies a ponder that is far more complex. But what is it asking? Again, that will depend on what is meant by the relevant presupposed concepts, in this case our chicken and egg. Because in counter to the position just offered, if we instead assume that the egg in the posit referred expressly to chicken eggs, well then we find the question framed totally anew. Because the answer now comes down to whether a chicken egg is primarily that which is laid by a chicken or that which contains a chicken. Since now we can argue that through the lens of evolution, the first chicken was parented by two birds whose DNA differed slightly from their offspring, the final mutation of the genus Gallus and the first class-specific jungle fowl. In other words, the answer will be egg if the egg is that from which the first chicken emerged, or chicken if the first chicken egg was instead this individual's maiden lay. But as it shows, it's more often got to do with how we choose to label things. As said, this is an ancient question. And so it's really only when we consider it through the eyes of an ancient scholar, unaffected by the labyrinths of biological classification, that the subtext becomes clear. When Aristotle stated there could not have been a first egg to give a beginning to birds, or there would have been a first bird which gave a beginning to eggs, there was no understanding of DNA, evolution, or prehistoric life. But more to the point, none of these newly acquired insights have resolved the underlying conundrum. They just kick the can further down the line. And so it's with this in mind that we can start to appreciate the thread that's being tugged at here. The answer that Aristotle gave himself was that the chain of events is infinite, with no beginning to speak of. Christian theologians who followed gave their answers with an air of arrogant confidence equal to our own, citing the story of Genesis and the beginning of the world. God created the first chicken, not from an egg, but out of nothing. And since the follow-up question, who created God, was forbidden, there was no further need to deal with uncomfortable paradoxes. At its heart, what came first is an inquiry into the living and the non-living universe. What came first? The life of the chicken or the apparently dead matter of the egg? And I am aware that it could be argued that eggs aren't technically dead due to their cells being alive, but Aristotle didn't know that, so we just need to be delicate with our interpretation. After the discovery of evolution, it became increasingly clear that this binary pairing of chicken and egg was actually a continuum that continued unbroken towards the birth of life on Earth, thus substituting what came first with the less friendly, how did life emerge from a dead universe? A question that remains unanswered to this day. Life begins with a cell. These simplest of entities draw upon energy, and with this they multiply. A success equated to the existence of life itself. Today, cellular organisms comprise the entirety of Earth's global biomass, though only 13% are non-plant. Single-celled organisms contribute the next most significant portion, with a 70 gigaton biomass that dwarfs the 2 gigaton collective of all animals. By current estimates, the human body is made of around 37 trillion cells, of which 57% are primarily non-human microbes, which means that 57% of our bodies are technically not human. What we consider our cells are first and foremost those of other cellular beings. But if our own inner matter is made up of life living upon life, what about the elements that make up these simplest of life forms? At what point does inanimate matter become living matter? What came first? Today, there are two families of cells we recognise as living, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. The more complex eukaryotes subdivide into the four kingdoms of protist, fungi, plants and animals, to which we contribute the most meagre of parts. The eukaryotes first appeared in the fossil records 2.7 billion years ago, about 1.3 billion years after the formation of the Earth. But it's the simpler of the two cell families, the prokaryotes, who are the true original inhabitants of the planet, showing up only a few million years after the formation of the Earth. But submerged within the microbiome lies the apparent boundary between these living and non-living units of matter. Unlike its more complex cousin, the prokaryote cell might not have any membrane-bound organelles or nucleus-protecting membranes, but they do have a wall which they use to protect their DNA and protein-forming RNA. But unlike animals, fungi or plants, cells have no living innards. The hard-working DNA, RNA and proteins are just considered chemically active. But are the lines that easily drawn? The only requirement we place on the category of life is that it must A. require energy, B. replicate, and C. change in response to stimuli. But this is just how we describe the cell. What we have done is use the cell to define a boundary, and as such, created it. However, there seems to be no significant shift from the realm of DNA to the realm of the cell, at least not in terms of material. No magical essence gets added to the cosmos once life is present, only new relationships and emergent behaviours. And so what we find is that our description of life is only that, a description, a conceptual boundary used to enable visualization and communication. But there was no unique catalyst, and definitely not one we would wish to attribute consciousness to. That conceptual boundary is hypothesized much higher in the food chain. And so rather than a light bulb moment, what we find is a dimmer switch, an analogue fading from the lifeless into living. Such was the case with our own emergence, as a single, non-conscious cell became 2, then 4, 8, and so on, whilst our mind's slow, quiet awakening shifted ever further into the light. An eternal flux, ever shifting, ever changing in time, never beginning in a moment. But though we may have failed to locate the objective life-defining boundary between cell and its parts, isn't there still some real objective divide between the lifeless state of the early universe and the life that followed? Surely something ticked. Though we might not fully understand how early Earth's elements combined to form the first building blocks of life, we do have a suite of experiments that have been pointing us in a clear direction for many decades, towards a world where dark skies and black oceans were interrupted only by the stab of lightning and the glow of hydrothermal vents. Because it is here, where seawater meets magma, that the carbon-based molecules were once urged to combine, forming the nucleic acids and organic compounds that are the building blocks of life. In 1952, chemist Stanley Miller performed a founding experiment that intended to imitate the environments of the early Earth. By simply subjecting simple elements to oxygen-depleted environments and then striking them with bolts of electricity, Miller began churning out bands of organic compounds. Tests have since needed reinvention as we have come to learn more about the early Earth, though Miller's beacon still stands as a helpful waypoint on the path to a greater understanding. But even so, the thinking is still the same as it was before. All these experiments seek are the coming into focus of new relationships, not new types. Whether organic compounds amid environments or chickens amid eggs, nothing seems set apart from the whole. So perhaps we should try to restate the question from a different angle. What about what came first, colour or the eye? Does this differ that much from the initial quandary? Well, to find that out, we must again dissect the question into its various presupposed concepts and ask, what is an eye and what is colour? According to the fossil record, the eye emerged sometime during the Cambrian explosion, a period of major experimentation in life's history dating to around 541 million years ago. The earliest and simplest of eyes would have been little more than eye spots, sensitive cells that use photoreceptor proteins to identify the presence of heightened electromagnetic radiation. And it's thought that the ability to detect colour evolved soon after. Okay, so what about colour? Well, thanks to Newton, we understand that colour is actually an attribute of light, and thanks to Maxwell, we also know that light is a vibration of the electromagnetic field. The electromagnetic field is, for us, omnipresent, in and of our every being and place. However, it is only between the play of 380 and 740 nanometers that we can appreciate these oscillating ripples as light and colour. So which came first, colour or the eye? Obviously, the electromagnetic field existed long before the first eye did, so colour wins, yeah? But then, that unique range of 380 to 740 nanometers, it had no special uniqueness before the arrival of sight. So, though the fields of vibrating energies may have been present, was the uniqueness that we attribute to colour anywhere present within the universe? Because once again, colour is not a thing unto itself. It's a relationship. A relationship between the energies of the universe and the knowing of consciousness. Because without this relationship, there is no redness of red or blueness of blue, or any brightness of light for that matter. So, does the eye win then? The first eyes saw no variation of colour, only dark and light patches. Well, that settles it. The eye wins. But then again, the first seen light must have still needed to inhabit some part of the visible light spectrum. All that colour is was still that which was being seen. It's just that it wasn't being subjectively divided into hues yet. White light is just the combination of all colours on the spectrum, so saying that a monochromatic shift in brightness is colourless is equal to saying that real colour is only the colour that we humans perceive. To our eyes, violet is a colour, but ultraviolet isn't. Though for a lion, ultraviolet is a perfectly respectable colour. It's just that red's not. The point is that our particular brand of colour only appeared when our particular brand of eyes and brains did. So, it was a tie then? We could say that, but for this to be considered factually true, a very stringent border of identity must be forced upon the puzzle pieces. Again, just as it was with the chicken and egg, it comes down to how we label things. So as long as an eye defines the visible light spectrum, and the visible light spectrum defines the eye, neither can pre-exist the other. But there's more to this thought, because when colour and eye emerged alongside one another, neither's fundamental state of being changed. When the waving electromagnetic energies were first seen, they never went through any state of change. But nor did the cellular arrangement of the eye. The genes and protein-coupled receptors found in eyes today were already present, only repurposed for their role in vision. Physically, each thing pre-existed its categorical description. And so there was no single spark of a moment, no single tick of a clock that this new relationship can be attributed to. Even the involvement of consciousness appears to precede the activity of sight, quite possibly by generations, since these organisms would have been reacting to the energies of electromagnetism in the form of heat long before the evolution of sight. What we have to remember is that the eye, as we know it, is not an independent phenomenon in the universe. An eye is only an eye when it is linked to a nervous system that can see. This means that it takes the mind to divide sight from warmth, meaning for some time in our history, heat and light would have been experienced via the one sense. Only as entities began to divide their environment into more curious and severe traits of uniqueness did our world's subjective qualities blossom. Until we no longer had to wander amid a wash of homogeneous electromagnetic radiation, as we were now found, discovered in a reality hidden in the merest sliver of frequencies. But if not a physical switch, what then gives birth to the relationship? What goes from being absent in the universe to being present? By ignoring the vast majority of its environment, consciousness has tricked itself into seeing itself. By ignoring the vast majority of its environment, we now think of ourselves and all other phenomena as that which are separate. So whether we talk of colours, eyes, chickens, eggs, life or lifelessness, it's never the collecting of information that causes relationships to emerge. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's the act of missing. Evolutionarily, we know that chickens and eggs each stem from the same origin, and that for this reason, neither could ever have come before the other. The universe merely did as it does until, from within a finite perspective, intentionally ignorant of its own infinity, a relationship became appreciable. Life and death gave rise to one another without ever having to start in a single moment. And so, it seems that we've all too soon crossed the borders of life and hit upon our next shoreline of understanding. But the question I see stretching out from here is, are we our bodies? After all, this was supposed to be the I that we identified as being alive at the beginning of our question how. The one who becomes aware of themselves when waking in the morning. The one who looks back at us in the mirror, who carries our head, eyes, and ideas around. One famous story related to this question is of Henrietta Lacks, who sadly passed away in 1951. In January of that year, Henny was admitted into Johns Hopkins Hospital with complaints of abdominal pain. At some time during her next several months of treatment, she was called in to have an X-ray. On this day, 2 samples of cancerous cells were taken from her cervix tissue. But upon removing the cells, cell biologist George Otto Gray discovered a curiosity, as it seemed that Henny's cells reproduced at a uniquely high rate, allowing them to be kept alive in the laboratory, proving extremely useful for ongoing medical studies. As a result, her cells were cultured and subsequently passed on to an enormous variety of academic communities, successfully facilitating countless life-saving studies worldwide, a practice that has continued to the present day. Since 1951, scientists have grown as much as 50 million metric tons of Henrietta's cells. And so I pose the question, is Henny immortal? Is she massive? Or are we just not the physical body? Firstly, it is all too widely known that just as the cells that made up your infant self are no longer a part of who you are today, neither will the cells of your current body be about when that much older version of you is enjoying your name. On average, it takes 7 to 15 years for the majority of our bodies to die, cell by cell, all the while being replaced by new cells. Our skeletons are replaced every 10 years, and our red blood cells are replaced every 4 to 6 months. Our skin is replaced over 2 to 4 weeks, and the cells in our stomach and intestines last a mere few days. But even though these versions of ourselves are gone both physically and mentally, we should notice that we don't mourn their loss as death. We instead consider the inheritance of their story as the continuation of life, which does seem to suggest that our idea of self is not one wholly retained within the physical matter. And if we look even closer towards the atomic scale of our bodies, and question the quantum body as a description of the self, well, then things really do become hazy, as our atoms haven't only been around for the majority of the universe's history, but they will continue to hang around for the rest of time. Inevitably, your precious star stuff will go back into the universe to live on for another day without you. Approximately 100 billion people have died across the history of our species. But when they did, their atoms continued. With 60% of their bodies being made of water, they mostly re-entered Earth's water cycle, continuing to support life in the process of plant photosynthesis and the production of oxygen. Equally, the carbohydrates left behind after death become nutrients that inevitably return to our diets. In fact, there isn't an atom in your body that hasn't once passed through the body of another person. So much so that there is approximately one atom in your body for every single breath that any human has ever taken. Every celebrity, every king, every moment in history, every achievement, every crucifixion, all of it literally exists in you. Within approximately 1 year from now, a tiny fraction of the breath that you just exhaled will exist within every human on this planet. Even your own descendants will one day take up your atoms, unwittingly converting the energy that was once you into the electrochemical reactions of their brains, enabling them to consider these very thoughts for themselves. Waves are not objects. Waves are just changes in the environment. And so it seems are we. A change that is entwined with the universe from start to end. And so I find it a curiously comforting thought that upon my death, a small count of radioactive atoms will be converted into helium atoms, light enough to escape the Earth's gravitational pull. And though some of these might find themselves merging with the Sun or Jupiter, it's considerably likely that the tiniest fraction of the body that I call mine shall continue to traverse the endless reaches of space, perhaps to roam freely until the very ends of time. Whatever that is. And so that's the story. Or at least it would have been up until the beginning of the 20th century, when, on closer inspection, it was discovered that those atomic bodies, those that shape this physical self, didn't appear to have a determinable existence for the most part anyway. So now may be the time for us to have that cheeky peek into the bizarre headspace we call quantum physics. For a century now, quantum physics has continued to challenge our understanding of this physical self, with few ideas more confronting than quantum superposition. A trait inherent to all quantum objects, it suggests an ability to exist in multiple states at the same time. As mentioned in prior chapters, the electrons of our atoms fly, sort of, around, again, sort of, the nucleus of the atom. But due to this nature of superposition, a more accurate description should clarify that neither the electrons nor the nucleus hold any particular location in either space or time, that is, until they are determined by an observer. As said, when envisioning quantum objects, it's often best to imagine them as hosting attributes more closely aligned with clouds rather than billiard balls, as quantum objects require both wave-like and particle-like qualities in order to describe their fundamental nature. But unlike clouds in the sky, a quantum object's cloud state is one of probability. The dynamics of this probability are given to us by the Schröedinger equation, a mathematical description of the wave function correlating with how likely it is that a particle will be found within any region of space. So if it is highly probable that a particle will be found within a particular location, then the wave function is also considered high. If improbable, then the wave function is low. And it is this wave of varying probability that is said to exist across the space where we first imagined our cloud to be. However, once we observe the object via measurement, we can temporarily gain an almost certain degree of knowledge concerning its location or momentum. When this happens, we say that the probability wave has collapsed. But whilst it remains unobserved, it is said to exist in a fluxing state of many positions, a superposition. The second half of this conundrum is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, an equally important equation in the world of quantum mechanics that describes how the limits of this knowledge teeter atop a seesaw of uncertainty, forbidding us from ever attaining a quantum object's location and momentum simultaneously. A quantum wavelength determined by an object's energy is like any other wave. No matter how short, it is always stretched out in space and time. Thus, the problems associated with wave-particle duality are highlighted since the location is primarily determined via its particle-like quality, whereas momentum is derived from its wave-like quality. So, like any ordinary photograph, as we focus on the freeze frame of location, it's clear how we always lose information regarding motion. Only when we stretch our measurement across a period of time, like with a movie, can we regain this information. Though, like the movie, though we attain motion, our knowledge of location between any two frames is entirely unknowable. Though it was Werner Heisenberg's 1927 equation that gave us an understanding of how this probability wave behaves, his initial intention was to describe the limitations of classical measurement. Classical meaning pre-quantum mechanics, i.e., things tend to stay where they're told. The principal problem, as Heisenberg saw it, was that to measure a particle's position with higher and higher accuracy, we must focus a wave of light into smaller and smaller wavelengths, i.e., higher frequencies. This is the quantum equivalent of looking at something. But with these ever-increasing frequencies will always come higher and higher energies, thus making it increasingly difficult not to affect the particle's momentum. The energies just kick the particle further along. Indeed, by the time we have reached an accuracy equivalent to Planck's constant, we have precisely zero knowledge concerning its momentum. This is our point of no return, a limit where neither location nor speed can have any meaning whatsoever, and thus the finest possible scale of quanta and measurement. But as we lower or widen our frequencies to achieve those desired subtler interactions, we inevitably start to forfeit any accuracy we had of its location. This, he proposed, was the observer effect. But it was Heisenberg's friend, mentor and collaborator Niels Bohr who, shortly after the equation's publication, endeavoured to push these findings beyond a description of mere knowledge, suggesting the presence of a far more important insight. An insight that was not only fundamental to the nature of the particle, but physicality itself. According to Bohr, not only should we have conflicting confidence in our knowledge of a quantum object's whereabouts, but this balancing act of uncertainty must also be true of its actuality. Because though both the waviness of its momentum and the particleness of its position appear necessary to describe the object, neither attribute should ever be considered an ultimate hierarchical quality of its nature. According to Bohr and the most widely taught interpretations of quantum mechanics today, it's not that we don't know where the particle is, it's that it literally does not have a location until observed. Prior to our knowing, it is said to exist in part everywhere, or at least everywhere where the wave function suggests a non-zero potential for existence. So, yeah, everywhere. An infinite superposition of locations. But this is not because it is some magical particle. It's because it's not a particle, nor is it a wave. Not really. Such claims can be dangerous, since we're all at the whim of our own subjective interpretation, and so without a mathematical understanding of what is essentially a mathematical idea, it's very easy to be misled. The truth is, we don't know, and possibly cannot know what's happening during the particle's wave state. All we know is that the equations correspond with measurement to an incredibly high accuracy. Thus, the interpretations have been wild and many, plenty of which we shall discuss in later chapters. However, it should be said that to date, no interpretation that has ever wished to force our once conventional ideals of deterministic realism back into the picture has ever successfully managed to do so without calling back onto the stage a whole suite of quantum peculiarities. Conceived by Erwin Schrödinger in 1935, the famous Shröedingers Cat thought experiment was initially devised to prove just how paradoxical this whole situation was. In it, Schrödinger proposed a device that would either withhold or release a vial of poison depending on the random decay of a quantum particle. But because this particle is thought to remain in a superposition of both states until observed, the poison should also be both released and withheld until observed. This means that if we were to place this contraption into a closed box with a cat, clearly Erwin was more of a dog man, then the cat too would be in a superposition of both dead and alive until observed. Though I've always been curious as to what the cat might have to say about all this. Even so, nowadays, this thought experiment is more often used to highlight the peculiarity of superposition, rather than deny its existence as originally intended. And so, if you are left somewhat baffled by all of this, please do not stress, as even the most outstanding physicists of all time have enjoyed brandishing the phrase, "If you think you understand quantum physics, then you don't understand quantum physics." But let's not allow that to slow us down. Let us see if we can fail to understand things in a little more detail. The following thought experiment, often given to first-year physics students, is one that attempts to show how superposition works in practice. Now, imagine we have three boxes, A, B, and C. The first, labelled A, has a single input and two outputs connecting it with box B. B also has two outputs connected to C, which itself has the two final outputs. Each box has the ability to measure and divide particles into two groups, reflecting some underlying binary quality. This could be up-down, on-off, hot-cold. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is that there are always two completely unrelated binary choices. In practice, this could be the spin of an electron or the polarization of a photon, but for our purposes, box A and C will simply measure the binary state of black or white, and box B will measure hard and soft. All this means is that if we fire one black particle into box A, it will always exit via the black output. One hard particle goes into B, and one hard particle exits via the hard output. That's it. These boxes measure and divide and nothing else. Okay, so first, let's fire a collection of 1,000 particles into box A, currently set to measure the particle state of either black or white. Upon doing this, we find an average 50-50 split, 500 white and 500 black particles. Now say that we close the white output and only allow the black particles to pass into box B. We can now measure the balance of hard and soft among these. When we do, our experiment again finds another average 50-50 split, 250 hard particles and 250 soft. But here is where things get a little more fun. Because when we close one of B's outputs and only allow for these 250 hard black particles to pass into box C, again set to measure black or white, what we find is that instead of all 250 still being black as one would assume, they have somehow split into that original 50-50 ratio, now appearing to be 125 black and 125 white. What seems to have happened is that by measuring the hardness state, we somehow changed these black particles into a mix of both black and white. Now this may already appear odd, but with further probing, things become, well, odder. So let's rerun the experiment. first passing our 1000 particles into box A and, as before, allowing only the 500 black particles into box B's hardness reader. But this time, once all 500 have had their hardness determined, we don't block any further paths. Instead, we allow all hard and soft particles to enter box C. And this time, we see that the final output has remained in its original state of 100% black. Allowing our particles to have had their hardness determined has had no effect on the shade this time. But why? What was different? The difference is that we don't know which of the two hardness options any individual particle was as it entered box C, since both hard and soft particles were allowed to enter the final reading. Therefore, it can no longer be determined which are hard and which are soft. That information has been destroyed. And so it wasn't the act of measuring hard or soft after all. It was the act of retaining the hard or soft information that determined whether or not our first set of measurements remained true. So whenever we block one of B's two hardness ports, the final 50-50 split of black and white resumes at C. We remove the block 100% black. Once we know one attribute, we cannot know the other. It is simply impossible to learn both at the same time. But we can now probe this experiment a little further. Based on our current test results, which said that a determined path of hardness will always give us uncertainty regarding shade, we can ask, which of the two outputs, hard or soft, did particles pass through in the second experiment? Because though we may not ever know the answer, there must still be one. However, we know it can't be as simple as the hard using the hard output or the soft using the soft, because, as we said, a determined path of hardness always gives us uncertainty regarding shade. If it was an ordinary determined path, we should find that 50-50 split of black and white resuming. So what could be happening? Maybe the particles are somehow going down both routes at the same time. The problem with that is that when we check, we only ever see full particles, never half particles. Okay, so what if the particles mysteriously bypassed the hardness box altogether, drifting outside of our experiment somehow? Well, if we close both outputs, no particles arrive at all, so that doesn't appear to be the answer either. The only answer we can give is that when we don't measure the particle's hardness state, it remains in a superposition of hard, soft, and neither all at once. But when we do measure the hardness, it collapses into that observed state, removing any determinability of the particle's shade. But it is important to note that this is not an issue with our measuring device, nor is it to be confused with the original observer effect problem that Heisenberg answered. According to many, these contrary results are the reflection of an uncertainty that is of the quantum object's very nature. But don't take my word for it, as you can run this same test yourself with only 3 pairs of polarized sunglasses. The way that polarized glasses work is that they only allow for the vertical rays of light to pass through, blocking those that fall horizontal to your face. An act that gives us knowledge about a quantum particle state, i.e., whether its wavelength was horizontal or vertically aligned. This is yet another example of a binary quantum question. And so, if we have one set of glasses, we block all vertical light, darkening the light that passes through, add a second pair and lay it perpendicular to the first, and we now block all horizontal waves, darkening the light almost completely. But add a third in between these two at a diagonal angle, and thus asking a second binary question. And we can no longer know which photons entered the first pair of sunglasses at vertical or horizontal angles. Meaning that by adding the third pair of sunglasses between the first two, we start to see the light paradoxically increase in brightness, And so, in relation to our original cloud that was said to surround the nucleus, this undetermined state is like the one that we described earlier, where there is an undetermined potential for an electron to be found in this or that space at any one time. The nature of an electron is to exist in a wave-like superposition across the entire area of the atom until physically measured, allowing it to then say, "Oh, here I am." In fact, it is this quality of superposition that binds atoms together, allowing them to form the higher molecules. The reason why the two oxygen atoms of an O2 oxygen molecule stick together is because they share an electron bound in superposition, existing in both of the two atoms at the same time. And budding physicists are all taught to interpret this quite literally, that the particle exists in a state of particle-wave duality. However, it's essential to understand that particle-wave duality isn't an entirely accurate title, because it isn't that the electron is both a particle and a wave, because it doesn't have to be either. More accurately, it's neither, for it is something else. It is something that has the attributes of either a particle or a wave, depending on how we look at it. It is a dance that is as equal in its being as it is in its becoming. Things can get even more complicated when we consider another bizarre pillar of quantum mechanics, entanglement. We will come back to this lovely little head melt in later chapters, but for now, remember that none of this weirdness is happening due to our technical inability to measure such smaller happenings, and therefore these peculiarities are just as relevant when describing the nature of our own physicality. But way, way, way back, at our more familiar macro scale of existence, where our body's own wave properties are so tiny that they're negligible, we can be happy enough to agree that, for the most part, our matter remains where we left it. Yes, reality might be non-deterministic and hazy at the scale of the very, very small, but this doesn't negate the validity of the classical physics we experience at the macro scale. Again, these are equal yet contradictory truths that reflect our underlying reality. To state that I am here or that I am only here when I am observed could both be equally accurate. A contradiction does not require one perspective to be considered an illusion. More likely, this hints at the limitations of our perspective, in part true, whilst eternally and infinitely incomplete. But after all of that, after the last few chapters and the many turning over of rocks in search for this physical self, it turns out that there are, in fact, a few human cells that, unlike most of our body, do hang about for the length of a lifetime. So can we call these cells an I, if only temporarily? The heart muscles will only be partially replaced over one's lifetime, leaving about half our heart in its original pre-birth cell arrangement. The inner lens of each eye, our tooth enamel, all stay with us for life. And most intriguingly of all, the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex, often referred to as the brain's grey matter, is the major outer mass surrounding the cerebellum. Present in our body even before its birth, it is also the most complex part of the brain, understood to be responsible for creating, understanding, perceiving. In fact, most higher cognitive processing happens here. Some part of our brain, such as the hippocampus, responsible for memory, do replace cells over time, but the cerebral cortex is essentially with you for life. Maybe the I that we seek lives here. Whilst neuroscience may be considered amongst the most cutting edge of scientific fields, the debate as to whether the mind is solely of the body or whether it may persist in some way beyond physicality has endured both undeterred and unresolved for almost as long as we have shared ideas. And so, as you and I have been seeking out the ground floor to this physical self, I have of course heard the raging in the wings, where, like a children's pantomime, voices excitedly chant, "He's behind you, he's behind you," has my own personal cacophony been, "The brain, he's inside the brain." So let's do it. Let's dive into the heady mess of synapses and neurons and see if our answers don't come any easier here. In the ancient world, it was common for thinkers to draw a sharp divide between mind and body. For the Egyptians, this self, mind, or soul was actually broken into several parts. Ka was that which stayed behind after one's death, watching over the resting place of the corporeal body, whilst Ba, a human-headed bird-like spirit, passed freely between our world and the next. And for those who transcended this world, Akh was the part of oneself that could walk amongst the gods. For the Chinese Taoist, it is a duality of sensibility and spirit that is said to disband upon death, with the lower soul falling away whilst the Hun continues to live on, holding as the object of our ancestral worship. In Hinduism, the sensorial self is called the Atman. This is the soul who remains tied to the wheel of samsara, cycling through endless death and rebirth until a state of karmic perfection is attained, allowing for the individual to be united with the unmanifest and immutable that is Brahman. Though a significant quota of these ancient theologies have survived to the current day, it is perhaps the now lost theories of the ancient Greeks that were to have the greatest influence over our modern theological landscape. As a metropolitan melting pot, Greece didn't actually have an official, organised religion as we would recognise today. There was, of course, the more familiar polytheistic world of gods and goddesses, each responsible for the many aspects of daily life, but beyond this were many various sects and cults. For those seeking enlightenment, outsider religions less spoken about in respectable company could be found hosting late-night rituals beyond city walls. These so-called mysteries were open to all people, regardless of gender, status or creed. A place where men, women, slaves and enslavers could each seek out the riddles of reality, more often whilst under the influence of various psychedelics. The first rule of Mystery Club: don't talk about Mystery Club, which is why there's little known about them today. But even with this being the case, it was these very same mystery religions that were to influence an individual whose contributions to philosophy would go on to shape much of what we know today as Christianity and Islam. Plato and his Allegory of the Cave give us our fundamental argument concerning this mind-body dilemma. In it, he describes human experience as analogous to a man sitting beside a fire within the depths of a cave, forced to forever watch the play of light and dark shadows as they dance upon his cave wall. Because for the man, this is reality. And though the cave opening might always be there, just out of sight, he never thinks to turn around because he, like us all, is bound to his interpretation, thus never considering the possibility that such a wondrous outside world might exist. Like many in the ancient world, Plato also argued for the immaterial nature of the soul, countering the arguments offered by his contemporaries, the Pythagoreans, who, though they may not have denied the existence of a soul, did nonetheless see it as being tied to the physical body, making them perhaps our best counterpart to today's collective of material nihilists. In his text, The Last Days of Socrates, Plato confronts this opposition to an eternal soul in a scene where the friends of Socrates are found seeking comfort from their beloved friend and mentor in the face of his imminent execution. In the text, the Pythagoreans liken the soul to the attunement of an instrument, where once the instrument has been destroyed, it can no longer attain the ability to support its ephemeral harmony. Though the metaphor may be poetic, it's still very likely that such thinking would sit quite well with any neurobiologist of today who sees the nature of consciousness as little more than an emergent property of the brain. The familiar protagonist of Plato's work, Socrates, responds to his friend's fears by focusing on what he considers to be the nature of the soul. He reasons that if the soul were a form of attunement emerging from the instrument, then the instrument's tendency towards either harmony or dissonance would equate to a harmony or dissonance of the soul. However, for Socrates, no soul can ever be considered less or more harmonious. The instrument may suffer states of dissonance, but the soul is that which is harmonious by its very nature. For Plato, this soul-defining harmony is not the product of the instrument, but something perhaps more akin to the natural ratios of intervals and harmony that exist as an intrinsic aspect of nature. A musicality of nature that exists due to little more than a natural symmetry of waves in the environment. A harmony so familiar to modern science that it is considered no less than fundamental to reality itself. For Socrates and Plato, the instrument is tuned to access this harmony, not create it. Similar to how a baby is born with particular abilities and skills that find their root in a history that precedes the infant, the attunement likewise precedes the instrument's existence. The harmony is of nature and balance, not of physical creation. For Plato, it just seems obvious that the soul should lead the body rather than the other way around, and it is for this reason that the body is considered mortal, whereas the soul is eternal, a mind beyond the body. Much is subtle in these ancient texts, and so much more can be gained from repeated readings. Still, even with that being the case, it wouldn't be for another 2 millennia before a rigid distinction between the mental and material would be categorically defined. This duality is often attributed to Descartes and his interpretation of the res cogitans, the cognitive, and the res extensa, the material. But even in the 17th century, not all saw the divide as definite. While still undoubtedly religious, Descartes' contemporary Spinoza saw mind and body not as separate parts of nature, but as unique reflections of a singular, unified infinite, where all aspects of nature could be considered both in and of a oneness that is God. A oneness that doesn't hold in any high praise either harmony or instrument, since both are of the sole source. In saying this, Spinoza gives support to Plato's allegory of the cave by highlighting the problems that arise when we conflate experience with reality. But at the same time, does he deny Plato's argument for a soul more harmonious than the body, stating that, quote, "There are philosophers who have convinced themselves that the motions of the heavens give rise to harmony. All this goes to show that everyone's judgment is a function of the disposition of his brain, or rather, that he mistakes for reality the way his brain is affected. The instrument and music are not separate, but neither are harmony and dissonance. Any such division is only a perspective of humanity. However, in recent times, evidence has begun to emerge suggesting that these ideologies are shifting, tending away from the dualities of old toward a more naturalist ideal of material-centered monism. Unlike Spinoza's spiritual monism, this modern monistic world is one of matter and nothing more. The once universally held belief that the mind or soul as separate from all that is physical is now becoming increasingly unfavourable with much of the younger demographic of the emerging world, who instead encourage the idea that this experience of self is simply an emergent phenomenon caused by purely functional, biological and electrical processes happening within the brain. Though the data is still relatively in its infancy, the ISSP survey on religion, carried out across 41 countries in 1991, 98, 08 and 2018, show an average global decrease in the number of people who believe in a God and, therefore, in an immaterial soul. Seen most dramatically within first world countries, concepts such as a higher self, now seemingly hard up against the evidence, are partly giving way to an atheist's faith in science, a shift that has been significantly influenced by the wider acceptance of scientifically advanced technologies, fueled by its ever-increasing powers of accessibility. A parallel change in global fertility rates does show that this trend of atheism will inevitably be undone as the more developed nations reduce their average number of children per family. However, the likelihood of this trend returning on a more global scale, once the unstoppable arm of communication reaches the extended world, does seem reasonable. Though as these technologies continue to rule our daily lives in these ever-increasing measures, it seems that our once culturally inspired ideas of self begin to require reinterpretation. But what exactly is this modern interpretation proposing? Bluntly, it suggests that the subjective self is emergent in the mind, whereas the mind itself is fundamentally physical. So what, if any, are the problems with this interpretation? Well, firstly, as we have found across the last 2 chapters, there is a lack of fundamental ground to this physicality, which can make it difficult for some to centre one phenomenon upon the other. And secondly, there still remains a vast chasm between our 2 worlds of mind and matter that is yet far from bridged. That said, among those seeking answers, it has far and away been those studying neuroscience that have attained the highest degree of success in terms of new insights. Our understanding of the mind and its behaviours, and, more acutely, the correlations between experience and neuronal activity, has been just as exponential as any other arm of the technological revolution. However, it must still be said that in no way have these successes eradicated the need for an independent, conscious driver. Instead, consciousness has retained a staunch defiance in the face of mechanical understanding, another in our shorelines of knowledge. However, for some, these obstacles are not considered insurmountable. Neuroscientists, the likes of Anil often claim that it's not a matter of if, but when we shall understand consciousness using these methods. According to Seth and other advocates, a mechanistic understanding is all that will be needed to unlock the nature of consciousness. But if this is true, does it then mean, as Nietzsche's madman put it, that God is dead and we have killed him? Because as this picture comes into focus, we should ask, what is it that we are left with? What is it that we gain from this materialistic philosophy and its hows concerning the brain? And what does it tell us about the self and the world we live in? Housed within 400 miles of fatty capillaries, this miraculous electrical network, consisting of 86 billion neurons, interlaced by another 100 trillion synapses, a figure greater than the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy, collectively provide a count of connections higher than the number of atoms found in the entire observable universe. It is, without question, the single most complex thing ever known. the most amazing thing about this 3-pound blubber of cells is not the number of ones and zeros that it can burn through, but that it is the place where every conscious experience takes place. Regardless of whether we take on the physicalist view or consider the perspective of an immaterial soul, the brain is still the place where the crosstalk of mind and matter takes place. So, for the sake of our ongoing investigation, let us for now agree and say that yes, it is here in the brain where every experience ever had, every sight, sound, touch or imagining takes place. So what would this mean? Well, what it means is that no experience you have ever had, be it the sight of your mother's face, the touch of your love, or even just the taste of your breakfast, none of it ever happened anywhere other than in the subjectivity of your experience. Because when materialism is taken seriously, none of these things we experience can really be said to have happened, at least not in the way we experience them. Because outside of the lightning storm of the brain, there is no way of knowing what forms or structures exist behind the limited translation of experience. As we have already discussed, outside of the brain, red is not red, blue is not blue, light is not bright, heat is not warm, and sound is not loud, for these are only the attributes of a conscious observer. The reality beyond interpretation is simply not one we have access to. Instead, it is the brain that receives the input from the countless vibrations of its environment, and it is the brain that converts this into our experience of waking life. 200 synapses fire every second, with each of these connected up to another 1,000 neurons, culminating in a set of actions that add up to more than 17 trillion different mental actions each and every second. Hundreds of billions of informational bits. But of this, we are only ever consciously aware of an approximate 2,000. And so it seems that the brain's power is more than just one's tool for navigating the world, since what it has been tasked with is something far more great, though less resource intensive. The activity of the brain is nothing less than the creation of your world and your experience of you in it. This explains why the vividness of dreams and hallucinations can be so inexorably real, since these altered states of consciousness are essentially the same phenomenon that causes our ordinary waking life. The only difference is the stream of vibrational input that influences each experience. But regardless of the method of input, we all know that the brain doesn't always get things right. All of us have, at one point in our lives, experienced some altered state or even a simple optical illusion where we have been fooled into seeing or hearing something that isn't there. For example, magenta. It doesn't exist, though we are all quite happy to believe it does. Now clearly, all colour is only a manifestation of the mind. That we have established. What came first, as we said. But what we do know about colour, beyond the experience of it, is that it is induced by our brains when translating the wave properties of photons. But what's odd about magenta is that it doesn't even have a corresponding wavelength. Our brains invent the colour. This is due to how our eyes have evolved to translate those wave properties, those frequencies that fall within the visible light spectrum. Human vision requires 3 cones to see our colour palette, with each cone tuned to respond to either red, green or blue. Any wavelength within this RGB range is averaged out between the 1 or 2 rods that it falls closest to. For example, halfway between red and green is yellow, and halfway between blue and green is cyan. But when something has that even blend of red and blue, being at either ends of the spectrum, the middle average point is green. So why do we see magenta? Well, we have a dedicated green rod. So our brains know what green is, and this just isn't it. So instead it sums the difference between blue and red mentally, inventing what we call magenta. An even more drastic example is synesthesia, a sensorial disorder that occurs when sensory pathways are crossed within the brain. Though not yet fully understood, it can result in a wide variety of hallucinations activated in the brain when receiving input from separate and apparently non-related senses, like seeing taste or hearing colour. Synesthetes can even see emotionally charged colours emerge from emotionally written text, so words of hate can appear red or calm can appear blue. Movements of shapes and colours can even be seen floating before the eyes whilst listening to music. And so, as we all know, the senses can be fooled, because the world we experience is only a world of interpretation. What science has come to realise is that our world is fundamentally made of physical vibrations, a wealth of harmonic symmetries spilt atop a cornucopia of mediums from molecules to potentialities. Though its experienced qualities are not necessarily of this same physicality. The quality of brightness, colour or noise are categorically not of the physical world because they do not belong to any description of the universe outside of consciousness. Instead, they seem to manifest purely within the mind and are emergent via this self in its capacity as consciousness. And so as we pursue our search for the self in the physical, regardless of what we may yet learn about the brain and its relation to mind, it seems that we have inadvertently learnt something unexpected about what this physicality is, i.e., something other than the world known by experience, suggesting that the real problem with the dualities of old may not be their untestable and highly conflated knowledge about a world that exists beyond our mortal experience, but the presumption that the world of our experience is itself equal with reality. This is the very point of Plato's Allegory of the cave. The fact is, we don't need to declare any knowledge about the world beyond our senses to know that the senses give us distortions of reality. To conflate the harmony found in experience, such as the beauty or ugliness of lights, sounds, or textures, with what reality is to take our perspective as ultimate. As Spinoza tells us, philosophers have driven themselves mad in presuming that God prefers order and harmony. And so, though we might ask, what does the universe look, sound, or even feel like outside of this conscious interpretation, we must eventually realise that because perspective is relative, these questions are meaningless. Just as in the case of classical Einsteinian relativity, where one cannot claim that any movement in space or time is an ultimate reflection of universal truth, neither can we claim any conscious perspective to be universal. Simply put, whenever we choose to look or listen to something, we are ourselves participating in the creation of that perspective. We are the frame from which that relative perspective can exist. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Because we are still left to ask, if the vessel that conjures the self cannot even stand up to the simplest of interrogations, how can we ever trust any understanding of the self, physical or otherwise? For it is here, within the brain's pantomime of the mind, that we create, nurture, and come to terms with our concept of self and I. Forged in the stories attained throughout our lives, we each hold on to and arrest the many concepts, events, and opinions that we take as synonymous with the self. Stories that we integrate and, in turn, reinforce as we learn who we are, as we learn where we came from, where we belong, who we were and who we have the ability to become. But as anyone who has experienced altered states can tell you, our attachment to these stories, these ideas of self, are far more fluid than what many of us would ever care to acknowledge. What we identify as the self is always wholly at the mercy of the senses and the brain's ability to translate its input accurately. This failing, the self that we know could disappear, and we could wake up tomorrow as anyone. As discussed in earlier chapters, the reasons why we instinctively fight such ideas of functional predeterminism, like the block universe description of time, or in this case, a mind determined by the physical attributes of the brain, is due to the ownership we wish to hold over our identities. We do not like time dictating the cause and effect of our experience, as we do not like to think that we are merely biological robots reacting to the biases of our internal machinery. And yet, contrary to these long-held inner desires, the more naturalistic, physicalist concept of self continues to rise in popularity every day. And so in the next chapter, let us ask, what is it about the knowledge we have acquired from the scientific revolution that, for many, has disintegrated any stable hope for an eternal self? And even if it does turn out to be correct, that we are mere biological machines with only an illusion of self, would this be the end of the road? Or can this, as an idea, take us somewhere new?